There is currently a Cold War between America and its allies and China. And Cold Wars can very easily, if not managed properly, become hot. Welcome back to the Sampan Viking on China channel. Today I am going to talk about the subject of war on China. This is a very complex subject. It has many facets, it involves many factors, and I'm going to try to simplify it as much as I can, so not to get the conversation too bogged down in detail, which, correct and fascinating, is not necessarily essential to understanding the subject that I wish to talk about today. First of all, can I say that I do not believe that war is in any way inevitable, and as long as there are cool minds on both sides who are not seeking military confrontation, the chances of an actual military confrontation remain very rare, very small. But there is a chance it could happen. There are ways in which it could quite easily come to pass if that is what people wished to happen. And this is going to look at what those methods are, what those ways are, how it would happen, and give an idea of the result of that. I won't say outcome. I'm not going to try to predict outcomes of any war. There are just too many factors, too many situations, too many variables. But I will take a look at the likely probability in any given set of situations. And also, of course, I'm not going to go into fanboy territory and start talking about particular weapon systems and how they may or may not fare against enemy corresponding systems on either side. It's not necessary. But what I am going to do is to take a look at the circumstances in which a war may start. I'm going to take a look at the balance of forces on both sides, and we're talking about the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy and the United States Navy. Talk about those previous conflicts, which may give us insight into what a modern major power conflict would look like. And then after some looking at the general scenarios in which this may take place, after that, then modify that by taking into account the important recent change, which is declarations from both Beijing and Moscow on the increasingly deep strategic Chinese-Russian partnership. Just to say, at the first instinct, I will say is that there is only one location, really, where the chances of both these powers coming into a major conflict with each other exists, and that is in relation to Taiwan. I cannot think of any others where there might be a flashpoint, there might be a skirmish, but nobody would let anything go too far over those particular areas. It doesn't matter. The place that matters is Taiwan, and if a conflict were to start in Taiwan, it would be for real, and it would be very, very large. So this is entirely what I'm going to concentrate on. And I'll add to it that this would include the South China Seas and the East China Seas, because these are both flanks of the same front. It's the same theatre, and it would all be involved across the entire Chinese seaboard. So just to begin with, again, I have to say is that remarkably, I planned this some weeks ago. This was a talk I planned at the beginning, at the inception of the channel. But just as I was about to do so, there are two major events which have had an impact in the way that I approach this. One was the Wendy Sherman diplomatic visit to Tianjin last week, earlier this week, which was in terms of diplomacy an absolute disaster, but it has had one tangible effect, which affects the conversation we're going to have today. The other is actually the results recently announced of some US war games precisely in this scenario. And that again reinforces, we should read between the lines, reinforces certain aspects of some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. Well, first of all, okay, let us go back to what we are talking about. We are talking about guided missile warfare at land and at sea, and guided missile warfare between two major well-matched powers, two cutting-edge tier 1 military powers. Looking for guidance from previous conflicts on this, is difficult. There are very few that can actually inform. Certainly for guided missile sea warfare, there's remarkably little, and for even for air warfare, the last major air conflict between opposing air forces that I can think of is actually the Korean War 70 years ago. And the only two other conflicts that really have anything to bring to this, in any sizable amount, you can look at pretty much any conflict really and say, well, it brings something. But for a serious contribution to the conversation, I can think of two, and they both occurred between 30 and 40 years ago. The first one would be the first Gulf War in 1990. Um, this is not so much due to how the war was fought, although it's useful to see the first time that a lot of modern weapon systems were brought into play, but more to do how the conflict was prepared, how it started, how the forces were brought in and put into position. More useful overall, although that bit older, and using generally an older generation of weapon systems, would be the Falklands War between the Argentine and Great Britain. This is more useful because this had two better matched sides, although the Royal Navy was still a premier world navy, and Argentina was still very much a third-rate military country. It wasn't exactly a fight of equals, but even that sense, from what did happen, I think is very useful to discuss. Let's just start very, very quickly then with the first Gulf War, what that tells us. Well, that was a textbook operation. Textbook in terms of the United States was able to announce its intention to attack months in advance. It was able to bring all its forces, a massive amount of force, into the theatre in a time and manner of its choosing. It was not subject to any attempts to interdict these forces whilst they were in progress. Um, the forces were not harried or attacked on the ground as they prepared for combat operations to start. In short, the United States was able to pick its ground, pick its time, and decide when it was going to start operations without any interference from the enemy whatsoever. And the fact is that the US military was so far in advance of its Iraqi opposition. In terms of the fighting, it really doesn't tell us anything at all. The Iraqi Air Force did not go up. There was no naval engagements between the two navies. It was simply the Americans had air supremacy from the word go, and it was simply a textbook example of how to demolish another country. But again, the fact that it is the method of operating, how it mattered to be able to bring forces into the area, uh, was in fact an important thing to consider. The Falklands, a different story altogether. This was the Royal Navy sailing across to the Falkland Islands, and the Falkland Islands are much further away from Argentina than Taiwan is from the Chinese mainland. And here there was significant opposition. Um, this was the only time, to my knowledge, where two nation states have fired anti-ship missiles at ships. And it is interesting to note that it's even with a very small number of planes able to fire a small number of missiles, the amount of damage done by the Argentines to the Royal Navy was definitely significant, especially considering all the other advantages that the Royal Navy had. Yes, the Royal Navy and the British Expeditionary Force won the war. They retook possession of the Falkland Islands, but the cost in terms of ships was very, very high. 6 ships were sunk, 4 of those were warships. One was an amphibious landing ship. One was the Atlantic Conveyor, a big cargo ship that had a lot of heavy military equipment on it, Chinook helicopters, armoured vehicles, all the rest of it. The loss of that equipment, had the British forces been up against a better supplied, better resourced enemy, could have made the difference between winning and losing that conflict. And in addition to the ships that were sunk, about another half dozen Royal Navy ships were mission killed, meaning that although they weren't sunk, they were no longer able to take any meaningful part in this engagement. One was damaged by an Exocet. Sheffield, of course, was sunk by an Exocet. The Atlantic Conveyor, I think, was sunk by Exocets. Um, but a lot of the damage was actually done by dumb bombs. And this is quite fascinating. Even back then, if you had a pound for every time a military instructor told you that the anti-air systems there weren't missiles, they were hit-iles. Oh, they're not missiles, they're hit-iles. I wouldn't be having to do this now because I could afford to very happily retire. But even with all these hit-iles on our most modern warships, a lot of quite elderly Argentine planes were able to drop dumb bombs right on top of these modern British warships. Does that translate into the modern day? Well, that's questionable now because the technologies have gone further, but it does show that unbeatable technological difference is not necessarily the end and be all. Yes, the Argentines did lose a lot of planes, but any military commander would sacrifice a plane for a frigate or a destroyer any day of the week. So you have to put that into perspective. It is expensive for the attacker. The missile, like the bomber, seems usually to get through, and that is an important consideration for any navy planning a long distance engagement. So let's take a look very quickly now at the Chinese and the American navies. In overall terms, the two navies, in terms of their military ships, are of roughly equal numbers overall, but there are huge differences within the classifications within those numbers. The United States Navy has more big ships. It has the bigger ocean-going expeditionary force. 11 super strike carriers, something like 25 cruisers, and 50 or so, 50 to 60 destroyers, large destroyers. This is all with their Aegis equipment. This is a very, very potent force, and of course add on about half a dozen helicopter carriers, amphibious assault ships, and numerous other amphibious landing craft as well. They have a very, very strong expeditionary force to contend with. China has the same number of ships, but the ships tend to be smaller. They have two operational carriers at the moment, both of which are a lot smaller than the Russian and the American strike carriers. They're based on the Russian carriers, which are referred to as heavy aviation cruisers, and the reason for them seems to be similar, that they are there to provide organic air cover to ships that are a significant distance from shore, rather than be the strike carriers that the Americans have. They have about 5 operational cruisers at the moment, well, two operational, 3 in the water, just waiting to come, and 3 more being built. A goodly number of destroyers, a lot of frigates, a massive number of corvettes, and about 100 or so missile attack ships. Now, in terms of a Taiwanese scenario, the difference in numbers isn't as great. The difference between the class of ships isn't as great as you might think. This is a combat in which China would be able to use all its navy. It's not too far away from shore. And in terms of killing power, there is a big difference now between a corvette of today and the corvette of 100 years ago, where hull size was definitely a limiting factor in terms of the size of the gun you could put on board into the hull, and therefore the distance and killing power that gun would have. Today, it's anti-ship cruise missiles. The missiles are generally standard. Some of the bigger ships have bigger missiles, but the missiles are generally standard across. So the actual range and killing power of a corvette or even a fast attack boat, is actually no different from the missiles launched from a big destroyer or a cruiser on the whole. So that advantage of the Americans is negated to an extent by the geography being so close. It's 140 miles Taiwan from the Chinese mainland. That is very, very close. It also means that virtually all the Chinese Air Force and a lot of its land missile systems would also be brought to bear. it would be a massive amount of firepower that can be used against the American fleet. The American fleet though, is a mighty fleet. It has its own air power. It would be able to call in long distance aviation and also aviation based closer to on many of the myriad bases in the region, especially longer range aircraft to help out. Overall, I think you have a pretty good balance of power between the two. Now, this brings us really to the scenario, and I think this is the essence of the conflict. When you talk to a lot of people, certainly on the aficionados of the Chinese side, of which I have to admit I am one, you do get a sense that when they think about the likelihood of a conflict between China and America over Taiwan, they see a very benign, they imagine a very benign scenario, which would be Taiwan declares independence. China immediately moves against Taiwan. It declares something like a 200-mile total exclusion zone around the island, where any enemy craft are going to be attacked and sunk or shot down out of their aircraft, and a wider zone where they reserve the right to attack, which is what the British did in the Falklands, which is how the General Belgrano was torpedoed, although it was a very long way away from the actual conflict zone. It was there. It looked as though it could have been a threat later on. It was neutralised then and there, and the Chinese, with their exclusion zones, would look to do exactly the same thing. So yes, Taiwan one day declares independence. The Chinese declare their exclusion zones. They start an invasion. The Americans respond, come to the aid of Taiwan, and either they come in piecemeal, in which they can easily be engaged, even from a distance, from thousands of miles out, and each carrier group engaged separately and annihilated, or they have to wait a great distance out and then come in en masse. After which China would have plenty of time to occupy the island and fortify themselves and position the navy around the island, and it would be a very uphill job for the United States Navy to then come in even en masse and try to drive the Chinese Navy away and start to remove Chinese forces that were communist forces, PLA forces that were actually dug in on the island. Um, there is actually another factor here. I will mention it. If I don't, other people will, but I haven't really taken it into account with Taiwan declaring independence. It's just worth saying is that the Kuomintang, who obviously made up usually a lot of the military on Taiwan, have never been particularly interested in separatism. They are as Chinese in their own minds as the mainlanders, only that they see themselves as the Republic of China as opposed to the People's Republic of China. But it is between these two parties that the strong core of there is one China is maintained. But for the sake of this, I'm not going to dwell on this. I'll just assume that independence is declared. Now, the scenario I've just described, it's never going to happen that way. If you're an interest in it, you can see the downfalls in it. The Chinese see the advantages in it. The Taiwanese can see the obvious pitfalls in it, and the American government and military certainly know the pitfalls of it as well. They are never going to declare independence in that way. It's never going to happen. So and in fact, I'll just mention that the war games that were carried out recently were actually in response to this sort of scenario. And they effectively said, if the Chinese are able to come in and take the island and hold it against us, it is going to be incredibly difficult to do anything back in that position. The geography favours them. It's very, very difficult, and we would suffer massive casualties and not necessarily achieve liberation of the island. This, I think, is the message that was coming across from that report. Although they didn't say that explicitly, but I think if you read it between the lines, this is what they are saying. No, if you were a Taiwanese president who wanted to declare independence and you had the support of the United States to do so, you would do it in this way. You would do it when all the major ships of the American Navy and other military assets were already there, when they'd already come into theatre, uh, either immediately around the island or close enough to be able to have an effect and come into a combat position within hours rather than days or weeks, and all originally primed. They would declare independence. Immediately, there would be a major amphibious landing from the Americans to reinforce the island. There would be land-based American aircraft brought in to bolster the air defenses. US air defense systems would be put down. It would all happen very quickly. It would be a coup de grace, effectively, against the Chinese. I have no doubt that they would then say to China, well, this is it, we've done it, you've got to accept it, or we are at war. I sadly think that the Chinese would never be able to accept this, and so war would be the inevitable outcome in this. And this would be an uphill fight for the Chinese forces, despite having the advantages of geography and proximity. It would be very expensive, and even if they were probably able to restrict US operations to a narrow band in the Philippine Seas behind the island, using their flanking positions, certainly in the South China Seas and to a extent in the East China Seas, it would be very difficult to actually land forces onto the island in sufficient quantities to overcome Taiwanese resistance and the US Marine Corps and other forces, land forces they might have moved in at that point at the same time. So it would, this is a bit of a nightmare for China. Either accept a humiliating climb down before the shooting starts, in which case America would say, well, look, we're still number one. China is a paper tiger. It can't even project power 150 miles from its shore against us. We are still the supreme power on planet Earth. Or they get locked into a vicious vicious fight. Uh, and even if it ends in a stalemate, it still has the Americans holding the island effectively. Taiwan remains independent, and a lot of cost even on both sides. But the Americans hold the territory. They can still say we've beaten them. So that is not comfortable, and the Chinese know it. So just as the Americans aren't going to go into a scenario where they are easily disadvantaged, nor the Chinese. And this is dangerous, because this certainly picks up also in the aftermath of Wendy Sherman's visit to Tianjin, because China has now said that it regards America as an adversary. And what that means is that whenever there is any doubt, whenever there is any uncertainty as to the intentions of an opponent's maneuvers, it will always be interpreted in the most negative light. And that's very true. So what happened early this week is actually makes the world a lot more dangerous than it was. And this means that, again, China knows that it can't allow America to support Taiwan to declare independence in the time, manner, and circumstances of its choosing. And this is where it gets dangerous. It means if it sees enough American Navy vessels and battle fleets moving into the general area, they will have to assume that this could be a preamble, a preemption of a declaration of independence by Taiwan, and it might decide that the only option it has itself to retain the initiative and to retain strategic superiority is to tactical superiority is to preempt itself and not wait for Taiwan to declare independence, but assume it's about to and react accordingly and launch its own preemptive strike to capture the island. So again, put in place the total exclusion zone, launch the invasion, and start to attack any United States ships that appear too close for comfort. That is obviously a very dangerous scenario, and the one where where the real fighting could start. Too many American ships in the same place at the same time from too many battle groups is enough to send up too many alarm bells in the Chinese leadership to allow it to be taken in a relaxed way, and fighting is likely to start. Like I said, now I'm not going to try and predict outcomes. Wars are fought on the basis of many different factors, and even on the quality of the men of the day, how good the systems are, and everybody always has surprises up their sleeves. It would be a slugfest. It would be a slugfest which favoured the person with the best starting position, and that means essentially the first person to grab Taiwan will be the people who, on balance of probability, will come out the winners at the end of the day, whenever that may be. And this conflict could drag on as a stalemate for many, many, many years. That is the situation as it stands today. Um, it, I'll just very briefly mention nuclear war as well, because I know that people will bring it up otherwise. Um, is there what happens if there is a tactical nuclear exchange? Well, I'm one of those people who does not believe in limited nuclear exchanges. I am firmly of the firm belief that the moment the threshold is crossed where nuclear weapons of any size or type are brought into the equation, it is just a rapid escalation from there to full global thermonuclear war. Because the moment these missiles start to fly, everybody assumes if they've got them, even if they're not in the fight directly, that they're probably going to be next, and everybody will simply try to get their stockpile out into the air, out onto target before somebody targets them. So once you cross that red line, that's curtains for everybody as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not going to worry too much about the effects of tactical nuclear weapons. It just means we will end up dead within a few days. In terms of the Chinese American confrontation over Taiwan, I think as things stand today, there is, there are many pathways to victory for both sides, but if China takes the initiative and is able to seize control of the island from the Kuomintang before the United States is able to respond, I would say it undoubtedly has the best chance of holding its gains and holding and winning the conflict. Likewise, if America was able to get its forces onto the island and recognize Taiwanese independence with its full fleet in place, then it would be very difficult for the Chinese to come and interdict, even if they managed to keep it under siege effectively for many, many years, or partial siege. It would be a long drawn out affair and a stalemate, which America would be able to claim as a victory. There is, however, a recent change which has a big effect on how this scenario is likely to play out, and I've mentioned this before. And this is the strategic Russian partnership between China and Russia. Um, this, I think, is a game changer in this strategy, because again the takeaway we can get from looking at the first Gulf War, that for America to be able to do this with China in relation to Taiwan, it pretty much needs to commit everything it's got, which is fine when you are able to keep a lid on everything else around the world. And I think that the strategic partnership with Russia that China now has is something that takes this very much in mind. Because I don't see Russian ships steaming out of Vladivostok to head down the East China Sea to join their Chinese allies to combat the USA. I don't think that's how it works. I believe that what it means is that the agreement is between all the parties in this, and possibly allies as well, would say, well, if one of us gets involved in a conflict with the US, NATO, we all get involved in conflict with the US and NATO in our own spheres of interest. So I think that would mean that the moment that action started on the Chinese side against Taiwan or the US Navy in the Philippine Sea, you would see Russian forces moving into the Ukraine, possibly the Baltic states, although that would be a bit more provocative than simply the Ukraine. You would undoubtedly see a lot of activity in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Syria to expel US forces there. You'd probably see a flare up on the on the Chinese, Pakistan, and India borders as another pressure point was brought to bear. And the moment there's too much trouble going on anywhere in the world, tying up superpowers, guaranteed the Korean War would flare up again, and forces would come into play. Likewise, if Japan started to get involved, the various thoughts on this. The Japanese are very unpopular in East Asia. None of the very few other East Asian countries would want to see Japanese forces becoming involved. But I think the moment they did, they would be countered by the Russian Navy in Vladivostok because they have their own issues with the Japanese, and they actually said as much just literally about a week ago, talking about islands that are disputed between them. So I think there would be a lot of other fires would suddenly break out, which meant that America would not, if it concentrated all its firepower to contest with China, it would be surrendering large other areas of interest as well. Now, rather than being an escalation in danger, I actually see this in being a modifying factor for peace, because I'm sure that the Americans understand this as well as anybody else. And so, given the knowledge that this is what they are likely to face in the event of any conflict between any of the parties in the partnership and their allies, I think this is the one optimistic note, that this is the impetus for all parties to seriously start negotiating in relation to these flashpoints to ensure that Cold Wars do not turn hot, or if if adventurism, where adventurism has caused these situations to occur, that they are rectified and and made safe, so that the volatile elements are removed from it. And indeed, maybe this is part of what we're starting to see now in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, as they realize that the dangers of allowing any of these sparks to happen um, are now too great, and that for America it would be too stretched to fight all of these wars simultaneously, which is what they would now have to do. And the only thing really is to find a proper diplomatic solution. Am I right? Well, I hope so, but only time will tell. The risk of war, although, as I said, not assured, is real, but hopefully manageable. And now that we have the new situation with the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, that the chance of the dangers of war start to recede as common sense and diplomacy once again come to the fore and start to regulate and even to pacify some of these very, very dangerous flashpoints that do exist in the world. Thank you very much for joining me for this discussion. I hope it covered points that you found of interest. Um, if you did enjoy this, please like, please subscribe, please share. Please also ring the bell. And if you want to discuss any of the points further, or think I missed anything, or think I got anything significantly wrong, please leave a comment. I'll be very interested to read and very interested to reply. Thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to you joining me in the not too distant future for another conversation on whatever that may be. Thank you.